Hello everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I recently passed the CompTIA Security Plus exam, and in this video I'll be sharing with you what I learned and how I learned it. Now first, a little bit about me. So I just graduated with a master's degree in cybersecurity. That was about a month ago. And in terms of my IT related experience, I've only done an internship in which I conducted a vulnerability assessment for a company. So in terms of, what's actually asked of you on the Security Plus exam, I haven't had much professional experience with the domains. And this also was my very first CompTIA exam. So I did not have the A+ or certification or Network Plus certification. In this video, first I'm going to start by explaining the resources that I used, and then I want to get into my methodology, right? How I used these resources to pass the exam on the first attempt. So the first resource here is the CompTIA All-in-One Textbook by Arthur Conklin and Greg White. This was my main resource for studying. It's a comprehensive textbook. It gives you everything that you need. Now, next is Professor Messer's YouTube course. Looking online and reading, all the Reddit forums and all the blog posts about people who have passed the Security Plus exam, almost all of them included Professor Messer's YouTube course. So it is definitely one that I would recommend to you. And for me, I used it as a supplement to the all-in-one textbook that I just mentioned. Now, third, I have Google on here. There may be times, at least for me, there were a handful of times where even after reading through the CompTIA textbook and watching, Professor Messer's YouTube course, I was still a little unclear maybe about a particular topic. So Google was very helpful. And then lastly, and now I did not actually use Jason Dion's Udemy course, but I've read online where a lot of people have, and it's been very helpful for them. So I figured I'd mention it here and share that with you. So let's take a look through each of these resources. All right, so here on the left side, I have the CompTIA Security Plus domains. This you can just Google, Security Plus 601 objectives, and you will find this PDF. You can download it. Got it right here. And also this on the right side, this is the book that I used. Let me show you a couple things that I really look at. So the table of contents, the authors here essentially just went down the list of these domains, of these objectives. And so it allows you to follow along with the objectives very well. And for me, this provided a bit more structure and organization to my overall studying. And I really appreciated that method. I have seen some other textbooks that sort of jump around, and I'm sure those authors have their reasons for what they're doing, but for me, this worked a little bit better. So as you can see, Chapter 1, Social Engineering Techniques. And we look at this right here, 1.1 says compare and contrast different types of social engineering techniques. Right, it talks about social engineering methods and tools, and then jumps right into it. So phishing, smishing, vishing, spam. See here, phishing, smishing, vishing, spam. And this is the structure of the entire book, right? The authors just go down the list of these objectives here. And like I said, that was incredibly helpful for me. Now, also, let me show you some of the first few pages here. You can kind of get a feel for how the textbook is. Essentially, for each of the objectives, you'll just get maybe a paragraph, couple paragraphs about each one. And the authors also provide these exam tips throughout the book. And I found these to be particularly helpful too. So that's just another positive thing about using this book. And let's scroll down. So at the end of each chapter, they'll provide this chapter review. And in the chapter review, you will get 10 questions that are very similar to the Security Plus, to the actual Security Plus questions. But they will only be about this chapter. Okay, so these 10 questions here, this is for Chapter 1. It's only going to be about social engineering techniques. And at the end, he provides you with somewhat detailed explanations of the answers. So, right there, I believe there's 35 chapters in this whole book. That's roughly 350 practice questions you get. Some of the chapters I think include a little less than 10 questions, so it's about 350 questions. But nonetheless, very helpful, and this really is great because it helps you. It really makes sure that you understand what you're reading, right? And there's a lot you can learn from these questions. So there's a couple things I wanted to point out there. Now, moving on to Professor Messer's course, and by the way, I'll put a link in the description to all of these resources. You don't have to search too much for them. But this is the CompTIA Security Plus 601 training course by Professor Messer. As you can see, there's 177 videos, 4.6 million views. All right, Professor Messer's been doing this for, I believe, like at least 10 years now. That is putting together these playlists and covering all of the Security Plus exams, along with Network Plus and A Plus. So this guy really knows his stuff. Professor Messer also just goes down the list. You can see phishing, right? 1.1, 1.1, just goes down, 1.2, 1.2. And so this makes it really easy to actually find the correct video, right? The video you're looking for. And like I said, it follows the same structure as the objectives and the CompTIA Security Plus all-in-one textbook that I mentioned. Now, I'm not going to show you Google or Jason Dion's course. I will put a link to Dion's Udemy course, though. All right, and these are the rest of the resources that I used. As you can see, they are just practice tests. So the first set of practice tests that I used were the Total Seminars practice tests. Some of the pros include a similar exam environment. It almost looks identical to the actual Security Plus exam. There are easy and difficult questions. So when you're first starting out, it's really nice to get a few easy questions that kind of refresh your memory on what you've been learning. But it's also nice to get difficult questions so that you can really see kind of what you're up against for the actual Security Plus exam. And also, these practice tests do provide explanations to the questions. Now, some of the cons. There are no performance-based questions. Now, if you don't already know, the performance-based questions are essentially questions on the Security Plus exam that are like matching or fill in the blank. Right? They're not the standard multiple choice questions, and I think you're guaranteed maybe 5 of them. But anyways, you're guaranteed at least some of these on the exam, so it's good to be familiar with them. And the fact that Total Seminars doesn't have any is kind of a downer. Now, also, each exam generates random questions, meaning they basically have a pool of, 350 to 400 questions. And when you generate a test, it just grabs questions from that pool. So, for example, if you take 2 exams back to back, you're most likely going to get a few questions, few of the same questions. So let's see. And with that, let me go ahead and show you what this actually looks like. All right, so here we are. We are at hub.totalsim.com. And let's go ahead and load the tester. Now, another thing, the TotalSim tests give you lots of customization. So if you wanted to, you could give yourself a quiz. You could give yourself all the questions, really test your endurance. And you can also choose the length of the test, right? Do you want to go for an hour and a half? Maybe you want to push yourself. Try it an hour, see how well you do. Or maybe you don't want to worry about time. Give yourself 3 hours. Take as much time as you need. You can also filter by the objectives. So you can select all the exam objectives if you want a bit more realistic exam. Or if you're really struggling with a particular domain, maybe you just want to focus on implementation. You can do that. And also, you can do it by chapter too. So that's pretty nice. And then there are 2 different types of test modes. So there's practice mode. It says practice mode provides optional assistance, hints, and explanations. Basically, the questions are going to be the same regardless if you're in practice mode or exam mode. But with practice mode, you have the option to click a button and basically get a hint that helps you answer the question. So could be good when you're first starting out and just taking a test for the first time. And then the other mode is exam mode, which, as it says, simulates the authentic exam experience. So essentially, you're not going to be able to get any hints or anything like that. All right, and now let's talk about Jason Dion's practice test. So the pros, these practice tests really do resemble the Security Plus a lot more than Total Seminars. As I mentioned before, Total Seminars will give you some pretty easy questions. But nonetheless, you'll still get difficult questions with Total Seminars. Anyways, so going back to Dion's test, the questions really do resemble the Security Plus, and you'll get detailed explanations. So the explanations are a bit better than Total Seminars. And also, by the way, So Total Seminars, you'll have access to these practice tests for free if you purchase the textbook that I recommended. If you don't, I'm not sure how much it costs to sort of have access to the practice test. Now with Jason Dion's practice test, you can get these on Udemy for $12.99. Udemy is always running, specials where they have these crazy discounts. So just wait, usually a couple days or a week, and they'll probably have one. So you can pick up these 6 practice tests for $12.99. Now let's look at some of the cons for Dion's practice test. The performance-based questions are multiple choice, meaning they don't simulate the actual performance-based questions. However, it is a step up from Total Seminars because at least you have them. And then also, and this is probably maybe the biggest frustration with Dion's practice test, is that it seems that he has recycled questions from the 501 and put them into the 601 test. So, Jason Dion has a course for the 501 Security Plus, and he has Security Plus 501 practice test as well. And in case you didn't know, the objectives are a bit different between the 501 and 601. And on the 501, some of the objectives focus a lot on cryptography. And so on Dion's practice tests, even the 601 exams that you'll purchase, that I used as well, you'll see questions that specifically ask about different types of, say, asymmetric or symmetric encryption algorithms. These are not things that you will know, and they're not things you should know based on the 601 objectives. So that can be a little frustrating. However, overall, Jason Dion's practice tests are really good, and I highly suggest that you use these. And let me show you really quickly what that looks like. Okay, so here we are on Udemy, and you can see over here you have the 6 practice tests to choose from. Obviously, I'm sure you noticed I did fairly well on this one. However, it was not my first time taking it, and I'll sort of get into my methodology a little bit later in this video. But just know, it shows you your percentage, how many questions you got, how much time it took you, the date, everything like that. You can review the questions, which is really nice. And then one thing that is particularly great about Dion's practice test, especially compared to Total Seminars, is that they give you the appropriate amount of questions. So you can see the first domain, 19, second domain, 17, third, 20, and the last two, 12. If you look closely at the domain objectives, you'll see that the domains are weighted differently, right? So the first and third domains essentially make up about half of the test. And this is something that for Total Seminars, for their practice test, I think they just give you roughly the same amount of questions from each domain. So it's not as accurate as it should be. But here, Dion solves that and gives you the correct proportion of questions. All right, and the final set of practice tests that I used were Professor Messer's. Pros. These were by far the most realistic practice questions. They also provide the most detailed explanations, and you get true performance-based questions. Now, the only con is that these practice tests come in a PDF. So, for example, when you're taking the test, you have to, for me, I just use pen and paper. But it adds time because you have to write everything out, right? Especially for the performance-based questions. You got to write everything out. And then when you get into the multiple choice questions, you got to write 1A, 2C, right? And so it just adds time to your overall test. However, not that big of a deal. And also, these practice tests are $25. So let me show you what these look like. All right, so here we are. This is the PDF. You can see it's 395 pages. And let's just scroll down, look at the contents. So you see there's 3 practice exams. And it starts you off with performance-based questions, which is just how the Security Plus actually is. And then you get into your multiple choice questions. Then he provides the multiple choice quick answers, which is just one page with all of the answers to the multiple choice questions. So it makes it really convenient for you checking your answers. And then he goes and provides the detailed answers. Now, look closely. The detailed answers start on page 35. And then the next thing is at page 131, right? So, you're getting roughly 95 pages of detailed answers for each exam. That's incredible. It really is. You can tell Professor Messer has spent a lot of time going through this. Like I said before, the questions are very, very close to the actual Security Plus exam. And then he goes into great detail to help you understand why certain answers are correct and why certain answers are incorrect. So for that, you definitely need to have purchase these and use these as practice before you take your actual exam. All right, now I want to get into my methodology. So I've broken this up into basically two different parts. The first part I've called initial understanding. The second part I've called implementation. Now, the Security Plus is a very broad exam, and chances are you're not going to be incredibly familiar with everything on it. So you're going to need to develop an initial understanding. Now, for me, there were lots of topics that were relatively new to me, especially in terms of, in cryptography, looking at, wireless authentication protocols, things like that. Those were pretty new. So it was important that I developed an initial understanding of all the topics, right? Because the Security Plus exam is not going to ask you, say, hey, right, what is mobile, what is MDM? You're going to get 4 options, mobile device management, right? That's not how this exam works. This exam tests your knowledge and your ability to implement the best solution to a given scenario or problem. So with that said, let's look at this here, how to get a good grasp of all the domain objectives. So the first thing I'd suggest you do is read over the objectives, right? You need to understand what's on the exam. You can kind of identify your weak points that you're going to need to focus a little more on as you're actually studying, and just kind of get a gauge for where you're at, And second, the next step, after you read the objectives, you should read the CompTIA all-in-one textbook and watch Professor Messer's YouTube course. As I mentioned before, the CompTIA all-in-one textbook is pretty comprehensive, gives you just about everything you need, and I use this as my main source. Now, I also supplemented that with Professor Messer's YouTube course. So what it looked like for me was reading through parts of the textbook, and then maybe before I was going to bed or as I'm eating dinner or maybe eating breakfast, whenever, I'm watching Professor Messer's YouTube course. So I'm learning about the topics initially in the textbook, and then I'm getting to hear the topics another time, usually from a different perspective, right? Usually I'm learning new things about various topics through Professor Messer's, kind of getting his perspective on things, which was really helpful. And then the third thing, right? So at this point, you've read over the objectives, you've read through the textbook once, and you've watched Professor Messer's entire course. You should be feeling a lot better about the exam than when you first started, right? You should have a good understanding of things. But now, for the third step, I suggest that you read the textbook again while going through the objectives. All right, so what this looks like, and what I did, is sat down with the objectives and just went through and asked myself, okay, what is phishing? What is vishing, right? What are all these things? And if I could give a solid definition and some examples, I felt, okay, I think I have a good understanding of this. Let's move on to the next part. So that's what I would suggest you do. Now, with this, there are going to be plenty of things you're going to need to reference. You're going to need to look back in the textbook and understand a little bit better. And then maybe if the textbook's a bit unclear, you can use Professor Messer's course, right? It's really easy, as I showed you before, really easy to find the correct video that you're looking for. But if that still doesn't work, go to Google. Probably the most notable time that happened to me, where the textbook wasn't very helpful, Professor Messer's course didn't help that much more, and I had to turn to Google, was learning about the different RAID levels. I actually found a great YouTube video by, I think it was like Power Cert Videos or Power Cert Animations. It explained everything perfectly, and it actually helped me understand the textbook a bit better. So that was just one example. You may have to do that for other things as well, but for me, that was just one time. And lastly, use Professor Messer's study groups. Now, let me show you what these look like. Okay, so here is the playlist of Professor Messer's study groups. He does these study groups once a month, and essentially he provides about 6 or 7 questions that are pretty realistic to the actual exam. But he provides you the question, gives you time to answer, and then he goes through and explains in detail the correct answers and why the incorrect answers are incorrect. I used these really before the practice test just to kind of get a gauge and familiarize myself with with practice questions, because up to this point, you've only been using the practice questions that are in the CompTIA all-in-one textbook. And it's a little bit unfair because you're able to, before you read the questions, you already know what they're going to be about. But this will be your first time getting questions from any of the domains at random, right? And for me, that's pretty helpful. And this also helps you kind of ease into taking full-length practice tests. All right, now at this point, you should feel pretty comfortable and pretty confident talking through each of the domain objectives. And once you're there, now you're ready to actually take some practice tests. So I suggest that you start with total seminars practice test. Take 1 or 2 of these. It's important once you take a test, be sure to review the answers before you take another one, right? That way you can improve, get better, and be ready for the next test. With these, I suggest you score hopefully at least 70%, hopefully closer to 80% or higher. If you're scoring lower than 70%, perhaps you want to consider going through, seeing which questions you're missing, which domain they're in. If they're all from, say, implementation or all from governance, maybe you want to go back and review that. But yes, hopefully you're scoring 70 to 80% on these, and you just need to take 1 or 2, review your answers, and move on to Jason Dion's practice test. Here you have 6 practice tests to go through. Once again, take a test, review the answers. Take a test, review the answers. What I did is I took a test usually in the morning or evenings, and then the following morning or evening reviewed the answers. So it took me about a week to go through all 6, and also I think I was scoring roughly like 78 to 86% were the range of scores for me. So that was the first go round. Then the following week, I took each test again. Now, you want to be careful not just memorize the answers, right? That'd be really bad. Unfortunately for me, that happened at least on a couple questions. I just couldn't help it. But for most of the questions, the vast majority of questions, I really understood why I missed the question, right? Or why I got a question right to begin with. But I was really starting to understand the explanations. Then I went ahead and took the practice test again the next week. And here, I think my lowest score was like a 95%. And I was going through the test pretty quickly, right? So for me, it was just taking the practice test again, just kind of affirmed that, hey, I actually do know the answers and actually understand. I'm actually understanding the questions and why the answers are correct. So for me, it gave me a good confidence boost. And from there, I went on to take Professor Messer's practice test. There's 3 of these. Once again, take a test, review the answers. Take a test, review the answers. That's what I did here. I scored roughly 85% on all 3 of these tests. Once again, went over the answers, understood why I missed some of the questions, and also understood why I got certain questions right. So yeah, I suggest you do that as well. I did not take these tests again. Once I finished these and reviewed the answers, I felt pretty confident for the Security Plus exam, and I went ahead and scheduled my exam, and sure enough, I did pass on the first attempt. All right, and then I'll close this video out just with some final thoughts. So once again, to reiterate, it's not enough to simply know the definitions of the domain objectives. On the exam, you will be presented with scenarios that ask you to provide the best option. Okay, so you really need to not only understand the domain objectives, but you have to be able to implement them. And you're going to learn how to implement them going through your practice tests and studying and reviewing those answers and truly understanding the answers. Now, second, I'd say know your ports and services, right? I mean, this is a given. I just want to make sure that everyone's clear. You also need to spend time studying your ports and services. And then lastly, make sure you understand all the performance-based questions on the practice exams. These performance-based questions, these are going to be, the closest things you have to what you'll actually see on the Security Plus exam. And so, for example, being able to set up firewall rules or, match certain things to one another, or use the RAID levels properly, right? These are things you're going to want to know how to do. And so I just want to make it clear, you certainly need to understand the performance-based questions in the practice exams. They will most likely help you out a lot on your actual Security Plus exam. And everyone, thank you for watching this video. Like I said, this is exactly what I did to pass the exam on the first attempt. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments, And I wish you all the best of luck as you take your Security Plus exam. And please do not forget to like and subscribe. Thank you very much.